Design system's always been like a contentious one for me, like personally, because when you're on the feature side of working on something, being told that these are the rules outside is quite hard, like hard to stomach. Because it's
Yeah,
like, no,
yeah,
I know what I'm doing. But then at the same time, as you become more mature as a designer, you realize, oh, listen, you're not designing a thing, you're designing something that's part of an ecosystem. And the overall importance of the consistency of that ecosystem requires you to use these things. It's the same way with branding guidelines. Like if you're working for Coca-Cola, you can't just redesign the logo because you feel like it. I mean,
yeah.
it'd be nice, but in order for like the overall to be part of the family, part of the ecosystem, your work has to feel like as a member of that family.
Out of it.
And so it's
Yeah.
the same thing like with design systems. It can be very challenging for design systems because you're not designing the features themselves. That's the sort of downside.
Hi everyone, welcome to Design Rise, where we interview the most forward-thinking, innovative creatives on the planet to inspire and help you to reach your full creative potential. In the episode, I got the chance to speak to Mustafa Kurtuldu, who is a staff product designer at Twitter and formerly a senior design lead at Google. Mustafa has over 20 years of design experience and actually a quite deep knowledge when it comes to the big picture of design, especially when it comes to design systems, which he developed in multiple situations in his past roles. In the episode, we dive deep into the relation of design as a creative discipline and how systems and tools shape this creativity, for the bad and the good. We also discuss why it actually helps designers to systemize their processes and how this actually allows designers to focus on where they actually can have the biggest impact, which is oftentimes the strategic side of design as well as the psychology aspects of the creative problem-solving process. I hope you enjoyed the episode. So I'm here with Mustafa Kurtuldu. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No worries.
So you're calling in from London.
Yeah.
You're working at Twitter as a staff product designer. And we're going to talk a little bit about your work at Twitter. Previously, you were working at Google and also made a lot of great experiences there. You have a lot of experience with design systems. So we're actually going to talk really about design systems, but there's more to design systems, I think, which we already learned. Like, I think we had a really good chat, like beginning of the week.
Yeah.
Also on like your thoughts on how do you intervent an experience? How do you integrate like friction sometimes into the experience? How do you work with visual hierarchy? And a lot of things which I think are going to be super valuable for the audience, for them to learn. And you're going to speak at a conference actually in Munich very soon. We also spoke a few years ago called Push Conference.
Yeah, hopefully in November.
November, exactly. So yeah, I think this is also going to be great. But maybe in your own words, you can discuss maybe or share a little bit about your journey, because you actually have been at a lot of different places. I think it's going to be interesting for the audience.
Yes, I mean, my original background was graphic design, web design. I've been in industry like over 20 years. And so kind of jumped around as the technology evolved, so as Flash came around and all of the interactive things that happened there. And I was really interested in moving image. But then obviously that fell out of fashion. So then slowly the web became mostly WordPress layouts because the technology just went down. So you couldn't do all the interactive things. And slowly, as the job titles changed, it went from web design to UI design to the UX design, kind of. So my background is mostly graphic and web, so that's why I evolved. And then really started maybe about 2010 as the practitioner side of UX. So when it comes to user interviews, like we did user research, but it was very light touchy compared to like if you compare it today. And so then I was working.
I think really in like 2008, 2010, like it really started to pick up. I think
Yeah.
because of the iPhone, right? And I think like just more sort of like more methods and more best practices got evolved there.
Yeah, I think when it comes to digital design, UX practices were mostly in San Francisco and like California. Like a lot of those things, like you had human interaction, design stuff, but it wasn't like in the UK. It was very agency model led. So
Yeah.
the practices weren't there. I mean, you see like a lot of like the agencies come out, like so Clear Left, for example, is like the most well known one in the UK, I think. But yeah, it wasn't really a thing. So that's when a lot of the conferences, like the conference world, was basically educating like designers about these things as people were sharing ideas. And so I started getting more and more into the actual practices. And then at one point I was working for Macmillan, which is like the science publisher of Nature magazine. And so I had a very good German friend there, Sven, who was a doctor in interaction design. And so he had a lot of the theoretical PhD side, and I had all the commercial. And together we started developing like our techniques and our ideas together. So I had applied commercial stuff, and he would be able to sort of go more into say, okay, what's the research in academia? So we bounced off, and so for 2.5 years, that's when I really started developing the practices. And then at that point, Google I was also at the same time giving talks in the community just because I really wanted to be a part of that community. And then Google saw what I was doing, and they said, "Hey, we're doing this thing called a design advocate, which is a designer who talks about design." And they had just released Material Design at that point, which is their design system. And so they were, and I was writing about this was all on the side as my full-time work. And so I was like, yeah, this was like a dream job. I never thought I would work for Google because it's like the idea for a designer that you would work at Google didn't make sense because like Google was an engineering company. And so, yeah, interviewed, got in, and then spent 6 years there, mostly as an advocate, like to begin with as an advocate, and then started designing more of the products as I missed the practitioner because you're just talking about it and working on some things. But and then towards the end, I spent the last 2 years working on Chrome. So I was working on the Android, Mac, Windows for like web platform. And the web platform is basically the design components engineers use. So if you've got an e-commerce site and you want to implement a payment method that pulls the person's autofill or like data that they've saved on their Google account, you implement the widget, which I would have designed, or like install the web app, or two-factor authentication. These are the things which I designed. And so it was almost the design system of the web. Prior to that, I mean, I did some stuff on Material Design Lite, which was the web implementation of Material Design. And so I had all this passion, this interest of working on design systems. It was just at Google wasn't feasible because everyone's in California and that team's very California specific. And so Twitter came along, said, "Hey, do you want to do it here?" And I was like, "Oh my God, yeah, of course." So then I jumped over to Twitter last year to be like their staff designer on design systems. So yeah, no, it's I've jumped around quite a bit, I suppose, in 20 years, but it's mostly because the way the industry has been, like job titles have changed so quickly. I think now it's product
absolutely.
Design is the fashionable thing. It'll probably change in 6 months. I don't know.
It's annoying. It's annoying. Yeah. I mean, I have less experience than 20 years, but I also even in my period, I've been seeing like a lot of different job titles being thrown around. I think something interesting that you also mentioned is that basically also it was for you basically that connection between art and then actually turn this into something tangible, which kind of interests you, right? So the combination of art and technology, right? I think very similar to me also, like that sort of like kind of how do you kind of like put sort of restrictions around the creativity and actually funnel into something that into something that people can use and sort of that play with the restriction. I think is kind of the interesting part.
Design systems always been like a contentious one for me, like personally, because when you're on the feature side of working on something, being told that these are the rules outside is quite hard to stomach, because it's like, no, I know what I'm doing. But then at the same time, as you become more mature as a designer, you realize, oh, listen, you're not designing a thing, you're designing something that's part of an ecosystem. And the overall importance of the consistency of that ecosystem requires you to use these things. It's the same way with branding guidelines. Like if you're working for Coca-Cola, you can't just redesign the logo because you feel like it. I mean, it'd be nice, but in order for like the overall to be part of the family, part of the ecosystem, your work has to feel like as a member of that family. And so it's the same thing like with design systems. It can be very challenging for design systems because you're not designing the features themselves. That's the sort of downside, because sometimes you're trying to create something without context. That's why it's really like the communication between like the feature and the design system is really important, so you understand.
As what people traditionally call like vertical and horizontal teams, right? So you have
exactly. Design systems are like, usually it's horizontal.
Exactly.
One great example of that was in the beginning when material design was actually forming. Like the typography scale was like really bad for dense UIs. So like I think when Inbox, I was interviewing like one of their designers, just trying to explain like how Google designers approach it. And it's like, yeah, if we tried to use the existing type system, we'd have like 3 emails on screen because it's just so much space. And so then they took the designs to the material team. So like, this isn't feasible. We need a typographic scale for dense UI. And together they were able to come up with like in context. And so that was like a great example of like a horizontal team and a product team working together to actually produce the thing, or like when they had guidance. So like bottom navigation on the Android system was quite controversial because it was an iOS pattern, and Material wanted to be opposite to iOS. But then like some of the Keep folks who like Keep is like a note-taking app on Android, they're like, look, our bottom navigation is popular with our users. If we change this, we see a loss in engagement. And so you can't, when as a design system team, if someone comes to you and says, here's the data to prove that your pattern is damaging to our product, you can't argue with that. And so that's why it's like the guides versus rules approach. So it's an interesting balance. Like, but you're designing tools, right? And so the most, like, if you look at history of design tools, the most effective ones were the ones that were most easy to use, like adoption. You look at jQuery was easy to use versus the other JavaScript. You look at WordPress wasn't necessarily the best implemented technology, but was the easiest to use. Flash was really easy to use. That's what adoption happens. And so like when Fireworks died, Sketch came about because it was really approachable as opposed to Photoshop, which unless you have a history of Adobe products, it's very hard to first like see. And so in terms of adoption, like for design systems, you always have to be like very approachable. And so that's an interesting approach because you're no longer designing a product, you're designing the tools that people use to build a product. So it's like an extra meta level of consideration.
No, absolutely. What you touch on is like so interesting. I mean, the font topic, I think a lot of people don't really understand it, but I appreciate that sort of like level of detail because like, no, the font is not a font. Like you cannot just use the font everywhere, right? So I give you an example, even at BMW, right? So if you look at there was also always a discussion about like, you know, font systems, etc., and like being in the car is very different to basically reading something on a poster, for example,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
So advertising. So like, you know, a font that works for marketing might not be a perfect font for the scenario of like reading information about like the speed you have, right? And you know, other things like you mentioned, just the density, right? So sometimes, and like I think a lot of people outside of the design world don't know how much goes into sort of just basically setting up a font in the right way for the specific use case you are actually designing for, and actually making sure the information you are kind of designing for actually gets basically channeled in the right way through the font, considering the scenario. So I think this is very important.
Yeah, I
A lot
remember.
of designers don't even, with their job, they don't even never have the chance to actually explore that, because I think right now there are so many design systems out there that you actually never really, that discussion that you just opened up, for example, with like, you know, the density of a font and so on. I think very few designers actually have a touch point with that, right? So
Yeah, no, it was interesting. Like a few years ago, like when I was at Google, I did like a design sprint workshop with an agency who were doing stuff for Mercedes. And one of the challenges they had is they had the branding guidelines, which had the typeface was a serif font, which looks beautiful on magazine, but in digital UI, it was really not legible. Like it was too thick and it bled into different ways. And so this is another challenging thing for like brands and products is how much do you give to the operating system versus how much do you customize yourself? So on iOS, it's San Francisco, and Android, it's Roboto, and on the web, it's Arial or Helvetica, depending on the platform, as the typical standard fonts. And so we were trying to argue, like in the design sprint, like saying, okay, your brand's really important, but if you want your brand to remain strong, you need to pick the places where you actually use this typeface because it's not legible for large bits of text, especially at smaller sizes. And I know in Germany, like especially when it comes to legal compliance, it's really critical that text is on screen to say, you know, and if it isn't, that's like has legal implications. But that text is not legible. Does that cause a problem as well? Which is another like touch point, like especially in Germany. And so we got through and said, listen, this typeface was designed for like these screens, like Android, like Roboto, and it's been designed to work on small scale. So this actually will help deliver. But it's an interesting balance. So like at Twitter, we originally were using the default OS's typefaces like San Francisco or Roboto. Now we created our own typeface called Chirp. And that was designed with a type foundry, like specifically to get to something that's legible, that still had the personality of Twitter on the platform. And so that's another way to take it, but it requires a lot of consideration to do that. Like the designing of Roboto and then Google Sans, which is the new typeface, it really requires a lot of like typographics. Like me, I've designed typefaces, but like they're more display typefaces. Like they're not legible at small
Yeah.
size, and it's a real specialist skill. It's like
Uh-huh.
iconography. Like we've been redesigning our iconography library to it as well. So it's like what it's a whole new language within itself. Um, so that I think so. The advice I would give to any designer is like lean into the operating system, because there's a whole host of designers and engineers who've worked on that. And when your company or product is mature enough, develop your own if it makes sense for your brand.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, like even with San Francisco font from Apple, I think like you can also see like I think the family of fonts also has been growing a little bit since the initial launch. I think with iOS 7 it was, or a little bit later maybe, because there are more and more use cases after you try to optimizing it for different touch points. And yeah, I think like people really don't know like the complexity that or like the depth that you can go in just on fonts. And like to your point, like even an interface, it really differs, of course. Maybe for some of the people in ours, this might be a low-hanging fruit, but is it a headline or is it a body text? Right, and we can
Yeah.
be a little bit more branded on the headline if it's a big and readable, etc. But with the body text, for example, you need to be really careful, right?
Yeah, no,
And
it's
yeah,
UX. So, I mean, typography and UX have a lot in common. Like, 'cause,
yeah,
type design is designed for a specific flow, how you read it. And so there's a lot of like conceptual, high level like things that apply to both. Like it's not a surprise that, Eric Spiekermann, who's the famous German typographer,
yeah.
fits really well at UX conferences when he talks about his typefaces in the process, because it's much more closer to typography design and UX, and much more close than say graphic design, because there's a lot more designing of like where you're trying to lead someone, similar to architecture. You're trying to guide people through like a flow. So yeah, but and also now we have
100%.
variable typography as well, which brings a whole new dimension in customization. And a couple of months ago, I was doing like some beta testing for Figma, like still introducing
Hmm.
new typography, like variable fonts. So it's really interesting. Like it's just how that is supported across different platforms. I think I think will spur a renaissance, but it's all dependent on the design tools that enable designers to kind of explore that space. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very important, like very interesting what you mentioned about typography and like the connection of UX. You can see this with all of the great creatives, even in the past. I mean, if you study a little bit of like design history and you go back to his architecture, right? And like a lot of the initial first designers actually have been architects, right? And if you read about their books and what they wrote, they already discussed UX. so
Yeah.
so basically they were saying like, okay, I build like a building here on that hill. In the morning, the sun comes from here. If people enter, they're gonna feel like this. So it's always been there. And you can apply this to all of the creative disciplines. I think that very often with these people where the work really stood out is, but there was always a certain narrative around like the sort of audience experience, either the visual experience or the more tangible experience with the artifact.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
mean, there's always a pendulum, like, because there's the politics of it as well, where you have one end is the decorative design that's supposed to have like some kind of spiritual meaning, and this is like the
mhm,
architect Lewis Kahn, the American architect, always said like buildings have to have a soul. So like religious buildings, typically like there's symbolism, like in churches in particular,
yeah,
there's symbolism everywhere, and then you have the postmodernists who are like, no, this has to be purely functional. And so at the other end of the spectrum, and so UX kind of
that's true.
like um which side do people lean on? And like typography had this in the 90s, where you had people who were inspired by the Bauhaus, very
Hmm.
pragmatic, and then you had people like who were inspired by the punk and grunge movements, where text could be a graphic that's not meant to be read. You have graffiti, you had Neville Brody, uh Stefan Sagmeister, like was all like distorting the type so it's like this imagery. And so it's an interesting, like, um I don't know if we've kind of had that in the UX digital design, when the beginning where it's like all of the Flash websites were unusable. Just like
Yeah, yeah.
really visually beautiful but terrible UX. But now you have usable things that appear boring. So I wonder if the pendulum.
It's swinging, and I think like what you can also see is like I think there's a certain, like just like in the fashion industry, and I think like now also I think like maybe it's because UX UI designer get bored, maybe, but like besides all of the sort of logic that is in place, there is certain also like there are aesthetic waves that are happening. I think
Yeah,
more and more. I think what you can see since maybe 1.5 years is, for example, this aspect of brutalism, right? Which is funny enough, sort of a word that you can also coin on the on art or like architecture
yeah,
as well, where this was also a trend. But you can see this with interfaces a lot that they're playing this brutalism aspect, right? Like basically doing like fonts like vertical and so on, right?
yeah.
And I think these are sort of like waves as well that you can now see within the sort of like UX UI world.
Yeah, no, I think usually it's down to the operating systems like Apple, Google, Samsung,
Influences
Windows.
most, yeah,
Yeah, it's like who they can help kick off these things because they're the platforms people
yeah,
design for. But at the same time, like, what was interesting about material design is they were pushing for things which weren't really as cohesive. And so it's forcing engineers to build things, and then that triggers other
and that
interesting things.
triggers a
Like
trend.
this.
You can see this a
Yes.
lot actually with Figma, for example. If you just look at like how similar a lot of the designs feel like because they're picking the same toolbox, right?
Yeah.
If you just look, for example, there's a general trend to use like 3D elements, right? But if you use one of the plugins, for example, on Figma, for example, Icon 8 or something like that, you automatically like it's very easy to pick these things, for example, and then automatically a lot of people are going to use that aesthetic, right? I think
Yeah, well, I
that's
mean,
kind of
it's
interesting.
interesting. As we moved from Photoshop to Sketch, you see a decline in the sort of 3D skeuomorphic style
It's most
designs.
compact.
And so then everything becomes very block graphic because when you draw something in Sketch, it's always 2D vector. So yeah, I think the design tools do influence. I mean, I think when we spoke earlier on the week, I was talking about like if you looked at say Andy Warhol and the Marilyn Monroe pictures and the can of soup, it was silk screen printing, and but it had all this dot effect, so that becomes almost the style. But that was really as a consequence of the tool because you couldn't.
Yeah,
That's as photorealistic as you could get it. So then it's interesting that becomes the style that's imitated, even though that's really a function of the tool. So that's always been there because it's really hard to design purely with digital tools. I mean, you could draw things. I mean, that's one way, but then that's only approximation. And I know what was interesting with it when material design was being made is they literally used paper and would take photographs of, say, like the Gmail icon or the original one, and look at how the shadows were. And I thought, okay, if we position the lights and define the rules of where the light source is, it will give us this thing. And they'll take photographs. Okay, that's the icon that's made of paper, and demonstrate a certain degree of depth, and then digitize that. That was a really interesting, like creative approach to get to where they were. It was really making the design tool work for them rather than them being dictated by the design tool. But I think that's just the
interesting.
risk of using plugins is you end up again, like as you said, like everything looks the same. It's like really it's you have to think from a conceptual level, what's the thing you're trying to tell?
Yeah.
And then just try and pull it in different directions. Like logo designers, they'll do 20 different ideas and then trying to restart like this concept. And that's what I like about design sprints because people just generate concepts, not necessarily
With
a
a certain
visual.
goal, right? With a goal
Yeah,
in mind.
exactly. Yeah. So like recently we did some design sprints at Twitter. Like, and the reason why I was given a project of an area of the product. I won't go into what it was, but I've never worked in that field before. And so the first thing's okay, let's get lightning talks, get everyone to do lightning talks so I can learn about it. And then the how might we note taking. And then just user journey mapping. It's okay, what's the job to be done? Like what is it the user's trying to accomplish? And just going with the engineer, like flagging the high points and the pain points. And it's like, wow, like I'm learning all this information that I would never have been able to get had we not gone through these exercises and activities. And then so then when it came to sort of like the crazy eights where you're just sketching ideas, you're free from the design tool because you're just thinking conceptually, okay, how can we actually solve these problems for these users? And I think doing those activities, then you feel the more creative side as a UX designer. And so you're not being forced. And then so sometimes when you're doing more the advanced creative stuff, that's when you say, okay, I want to have this like emotional feel. So when Twitter was working on its design system, the first thing was let's come up with principles, comparing themselves to other social media companies. And we publish this publicly. You can see like bullet points of the different, you know, what's the image you want to give. And if you start from that point, which is interesting for a designer to write stuff down, but it's actually really powerful. Like what you're trying to represent. And then, so then when you think, okay, then maybe you sketch the idea, or you might go into Figma or whatever. Then you're actually designing what you're trying to say rather than letting the tool pull you to this 3D effect or this trend or whatever.
Yeah.
But it requires a lot of energy and time. Like,
I feel like, what you just mentioned with the design sprint and the, going out of the design tool in a certain way. I think like as this getting more and more popular, also there is a big majority of designers who never experienced that because there's so much into sort of flashing out screens that
yeah,
there is a sort of like, of course, like especially in this podcast we talk about this a lot, like the other side of the design, which is more about the maybe the strategy and the creativity of like coming up with concepts, etc. And I think like, yeah, I think like because design is getting so demanded right now on just specifically UX UI design, that this is also a world of design that as popular it is also maybe not so accessible to a lot of people in the design community, specifically the ones that are maybe more on roles that are more on the execution of the sort of concept.
yeah. No, I mean, it's always tricky. Like I was working for like a newspaper publisher, and we were just like told to just bang out the designs because it's advertising or whatever.
Yeah.
And that environment is really hard. But I still would try and sketch things when there was more opportunity to do that. Like I think sketching. I remember there was a comedian who said like when he was becoming a comedian, he was advised to take acting classes because that's all like you're on stage. It's all about a performance, and so acting will teach you like the sort of the binary of what a performance is. And I think for design, it's kind of like sketching and drawing. That's the binary of design, like the ones and zeros. So having not being like necessarily like Leonardo da Vinci, but having some sketching skills or just having it in your daily practice, I think reminds you of some of the more fundamentals of design. Like so, like when we do paper prototyping, like I did this with Delivery Hero in Berlin. I did a workshop with them, and I was just showing them like what paper prototyping is, and how just the activity where one person is pretending to be the computer, and you've got this like really basic rudimentary, and someone's pressing the paper, and the computer is moving stuff, and just seeing how when you break it down to the baseline elements, how they completely changed what they end up designing because what they originally did was completely failed. And so it's like if you break it down to like the Latin, as it were, of UX or of design, which is like the sketching, then you start thinking, okay, right, what is design? What does it mean to be design? I always say it's contrast. I mean, that's the baseline. Everything you can define as contrast. Like you look at a block of text, there's no hierarchy, there's no contrast, you can't read it. But then you look at another piece of text, the title's enlarged, there's indentation, text is in, there's top caps, designing the contrast to make the flow of what it is you're creating. And it's like the same with anything, like to press a button on a kettle because it's sticking out because it's contrasting to the rest of the shape, because that's the affordance. And so that's how I kind of say it's like, and once you start understanding, you're rediscovering that, you realize that Figma is the tool, you're not the tool.
Yeah. And you have to experience yourself as a designer in different tools, which are maybe feel a little bit sort of unfamiliar maybe at the beginning, but it just makes you grow as a designer. And I think sketching being like one of them for sure. You mentioned Google Material Design a couple of times, and I think let's maybe talk about this shortly, because I think it's so interesting to sort of the evolution that we are seeing when it comes to operating systems, because obviously Google Material U actually has been brought up a whole lot of personalization, right? Because there was a certain way how the design system works, with like basically being basically driven by the background image, which is kind of interesting because that's what people actually change the most. People rather change the background image than actually going into like a theme picker. But I kind of being driven by that, I think so interesting. And then like, you could see like Apple has been now doing that push too. And before even, I think like Apple did it, and I think even before Google did it, where a lot of like, I think there was some kind of hack on Apple, basically that you could, in a certain way, you can basically modify your sort of home screen and basically pick different icons, etc. And I think people just start to do this a lot.
I think, this was always been like from Mac OS 7 I remember there was a plugin where you could change the trash can, and so Oscar from Sesame Street will come out and say, "I love it because it's trash." And you just make folders to leave just to trigger that. So the customization in Windows, obviously Winamp, the customization Myspace, like this idea where the user defines what the UI is to suit their personality.
Yeah, but
It's existed
100%.
for like yeah.
Yeah, always. People always wanted to like push the boundaries there.
The question is it right?
Yeah, so kind of like I think like it's hard to see from outside, but if you work on an operating system, once you kind of learn that this is the current discussion, this is always the ongoing discussion. How much are we branded? So, for example, at BMW, that's a very active discussion because the whole digital experience is very branded because it's a very emotional product. Like it's very different to Google, which is a more sort of open software where more people has to be way more inclusive, right? So of course, like you constantly have the discussion, what is actually Google or brand X, and what is like how much personalization do we allow? And it's very different also. As I'm explaining this, I'm noticing it's very different to maybe like depending on the brand. But because there's always a fear, of course, of designers that people do ugly stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And
So
and I think that's a kind of interesting discussion now. Like both systems have been completely opening up. I think like in a controlled space still. I think
yeah,
like
I mean,
very yeah.
yeah. So I mean, in the beginning, well, if we look at say the popular design systems, the one that really I think kicked it off was Bootstrap, which was Twitter's one. And that was the idea of that because on the web everything was inconsistent and everyone's making these custom components again and again. It's like, how do you make a baseline thing that's customizable? The problem with Bootstrap is every site that used it, you could tell it was Bootstrap. So it was like, it was so obvious. And so when material design came, materials are in the hierarchy. I mean, obviously Apple had the UI guidelines, but it was hard to really, it wasn't accessible,
Yeah.
And so when material design came along, it was very accessible and it was very visual. Like you could understand what was going on.
Really good documentation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, the product for design systems is the documentation as well as the components. Like it is design systems product. The challenge though is the first material was that when you looked at Gmail and you looked at Microsoft's Outlook, without side by side, they looked identical, apart from one had a blue bar at the top and one had a red bar at the top. And so when it came to material two, it's like, all right, how can we, like, we created these guidelines that were quite strict. How can we make it so that the personality of the product can still shine through by still living within the ecosystem of like Android? So like the pattern, the UX patterns are still the same, but it feels like a BMW app or a Microsoft app or whatever, but still a part of a family. And so Material 2 started allowing custom shapes and custom like typefaces to a much more larger extent. And then you start seeing the sort of that started going to the customization where Material U was like the next step in that, where that it's the user defining the customization. I have interesting thoughts about that. Like, I think as a designer, you have to make the decision, like what works best, because there's going to be some colors which just look horrible. Like some of the examples I see on Google, I mean, the green colors just look like pee to me. Like it visually looks horrible. And it's like, why are you giving so much control to the user? Like you are the professional, you should be defining that. I understand customization, but I think, I don't know, it's like, imagine a car company and the user can define what, like, the shell of the car. I mean, that seems a bit, or the color of the windows. It's like, no. There's reasons why these are defined. Here's a predefined list that you can buy, pearlescent paint, red, black, blue, whatever, but it's still within this control because you're the designer of it. And so I understand this kind of theming, but it just, you look, and another thing is products don't like it, like product companies, because it's like, I don't want my
There's
logo.
a logo on it, right? There's a logo still on it, right?
You have like companies with 100-year branding, and you're just going to give away the core color, which is the identifier, out. And it's like, no. Like my product needs there was when I was working at Google, they changed all the icons of their apps, and it was mocked internally. Like, how could you, like, to this day I still struggle to find Google Maps, like, because it's like, okay, you make them look similar, but now you can't distinguish between them. But that's a design flaw. Like, things have to be identifiable. And I think if you add this next dimension of color, that's quite painful. But I mean, I think it's good to explore these things. I think 'cause you might find some other use case that you never would have considered as a result. So, um, but like we saw what happened, MySpace and Facebook. Facebook won because MySpace became a mess. Like it didn't win because it was a better product for at that time. MySpace had won, but the customization killed it.
No, very true, and that's a problem. All of the all digital mainstream products face if they're not purely utility driven, right?
Yeah,
Because they they get adding too many functions and like people can't follow at some point anymore. If they add the personalization on top at some point, like people just get like very lost. I have to say, like with some of the applications that actually they're very mature, and then the add personalization on top, sometimes I'm like even sometimes a little bit lost maybe, and then it feels it feels very heavy, and then you kind of wish for something that's just more lighter, and
yeah. But I
yeah,
mean, how much of that do people actually want? I mean, there was I mean, I know
exactly,
this is a movie, but there was the Steve Jobs film where him and Steve Wozniak in the film are arguing,
yeah,
and Steve's saying people don't need customization, and he's like, no, they do. And I think there's a certain type of person who like maybe engineering mind who likes to tinker and change to see what could be possible. The majority of people just want something that works. Like,
yeah,
do I want my kettle to be personable to me? No, I just want it to boil water. Like, maybe you might change the home screen image because there is something sentimental about having your loved one's photograph every time you look at it. And there's also maybe it's like your wedding ring. You wear it maybe because if you don't, your partner will be like, why aren't you wearing it? So having their photograph on the phone, maybe there's like a social, like cultural thing there. But does that mean that you should style the colors of the device based on that? I mean, is that the reason why people change?
yeah.
Younger audiences, perhaps, like younger kids who like changing things there all the time. But I haven't changed my home screen image on one of my phones in about 15 years. It's always been the same. So, but then maybe I'm not the core audience. That's the thing,
Mm.
Like,
There's a differentiation aspect to this as well that you are touching on. Basically, sometimes it could differentiate towards like another solution if you allow for that and maybe cater towards like, for example, in what you just mentioned, a very young target group. And I think that's also very interesting what you said about like, yeah, like the brand. I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of correlation between like the brand value, maybe, or the emotionalization of the brand, and like how selective and articulate you actually have to be. Because like if you look at really like high-end brands, they're like, but there's just one color, like
yeah,
that's it, right? And that's like, that's why people are gonna use it, right? And I think that that's very interesting. Well, maybe some of the more inclusive products, you can be maybe much more flexible.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it depends. If you have a very cultural icon, then maybe like the Twitter bird, like that's very iconic, like or
yeah,
the Facebook F or the Apple's
yeah.
Apple. That's really distinct. But then once you go from that, like you know,
It really depends. Like yeah, like a lot of the products, the color is maybe not even the sort of like the key aspect, right?
but yeah, but then
Yeah,
in terms of a UX point of view, maybe it doesn't matter so much because people opening apps becomes muscle memory. Like people don't use most of the apps people install will never use, and so they'll have a set number on their home screen, and they'll just go to that regardless. And if the apps move around, it causes some kind of cognitive dissonance, and so they reorder all their icons. So maybe it doesn't matter that much, but I don't know. I think we
yeah.
designers should make the decisions, not pass it on to the user.
The other aspect is the freshness aspect, right? I think like sometimes you need to, for example, visually change something to make people understand that there's a bigger functional update, right? Or
Yeah,
bigger product update, which is kind of also interesting, right? Where sort of like it's almost like marketing, right?
yeah,
It's
of
like we
course.
need to communicate that this is the next version. So on the key shot, it needs to be visual, right? That this is something new, right?
Yeah, no,
And
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, no, you could say obviously because if someone spends like €1,000 or pounds, dollars on a device and it looks exactly like their existing phone,
the problem. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so which is an interesting thing. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I think this probably is a pendulum. It'll probably swing back to being more um, restricted at some point. But yeah,
Yeah.
but then this is the mobile space on the web. It's the Wild West. You can do whatever you want, and
Yeah.
within reason, I suppose.
If we're thinking about design systems as we're anyway so deep into it, So what, like, I think like the overarching story here, I think, is like systemization of basically the execution of digital products and the development of the products, which is on the one side of like closing down creativity, but at the same time, of course, you still have a lot of opportunities, and there's the push and pull that you were describing between like maybe horizontal and vertical teams and pro. But if you're looking like big picture, right? Like I think like more and more gets systemized, but the where do you see design systems going forward? Like if you think a little bit out, like 3 to 8 years, like what do you think? Like what's the big story of the design systems? What do you think how it's going to impact designers in the long run?
I think, I mean, once they become more integrated into the tools, then I think that's when more interesting things can happen. I mean, one challenge that you have on design systems is how much of the thing do you build? Like you have this concept of tokens. So the tokens are the baseline elements, the typeface, the colors, the shadow. Um,
Mhm.
and so as a design a systems designer, you sometimes create components. But it's like, how much of that do you actually do? Should you be doing that? Like, so long as you have the baseline rules of these are the margin padding and whatever, allow the designer to be creative within that restriction. Any more restriction to that becomes problematic. The downside is designers will end up creating, I don't know, a setting UI again and again when
Yeah.
really it's more or less the same. In terms of the creativity, I suppose it's like, what is creative? Like, I mean, if you're if you want to create like artistic logo design, visual design from scratch, um, that's not really what the job is, I don't think, as UX. I mean, the
Yeah.
creativity is like trying to get to, like, for new products that you might be to like amazing new UI. Sure, but like for most of sort of like the big companies, you're trying to improve like a problem space.
Yeah.
Um, and so like you see
Yeah.
Twitter circles, which is like come out where you can tweet to a specific group of people, uh, because you might not want something to go out to everyone. And so then it's like, how do you help people do that? And so you're designing the flow and then the UI around it. And once the UI is supplementary, it's all about how do you feed this pain point that someone's trying to create. The thing that you're designing, it requires some new paradigm. But then in UX, you have a choice, right? You meet the user where they are, and so where their mental model is, or you
Yeah.
have to teach someone a new thing. So like pinch to zoom was a new thing, pull to refresh was a new thing. How do you teach people this? So then there's an expectation, there's a whole onboarding thing that happens, like that's creative. So I mean, that's when it is. It's like, I think for new UX designers, sometimes it can be hard. Oh, what, I have to just copy and paste these widgets and then relay them out. No, you're thinking about what is it
Yeah.
that the pain point you're trying to solve for the user, and then that's when you use the tool. And so that's why it goes back to the beginning of like sketching stuff out, like, and paper prototyping, because then you can say, right, forget the design system. Let's think, what is the flow? What is the thing that we're trying to do?
Yeah.
And then you can work with the design systems team, say like, we need an illustration style. We need this visual, like, and that's when you're doing the creative thing, but it's intentional creative things. Like it's to help people do something. And so,
No,
yeah,
100%. Like creativity, of course, is like a broad term, but I think, like as you said, like on the what is the job to be done here, right?
yeah,
And like how can you sort of like come up with creative solutions there? And on that side, maybe it's not so relevant, like how you actually execute it and later visually, because I mean it should just like follow the system, right? And and then basically it's actually make the UX designer focus on where the UX designer can actually have the biggest impact, which
yeah,
is not so much on the radius, but it's rather on like how you actually design the experience, if it makes sense, how did we test it, what do people, where's the mental state, like what's the mental model of people, and a lot of other questions to solve, which are probably even more important. And then, like, okay, if you actually want to execute something more creative, then you actually maybe invest more into the UI than at the later point. But I think maybe for the UX side, it just like helps.
yeah. And I think the creative part is when you're trying to find what is the pain point.
Yeah.
So I mean, to some of the stuff that we spoke when we in the introduction, talking about hacking user perception, which is another thing which I've done, like especially at Google, and
Mm.
perceptively understanding what people are trying to achieve. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about at like Push conference. And so one story which I always talk about is like Houston Airport. and Houston Airport had a problem with passengers complaining about their luggage, how long it take to come after the plane had landed. And so they spent millions optimizing the process, employing new tech, hiring new staff, new training processes, and they got it down to 7 minutes. But passengers still complained. So they said, okay, what is the actual problem? Is it you can't get the suitcases quicker than 7 minutes without damaging them? Like, because that's realistically as fast. And they noticed that the planes would park right next to the terminal building when they landed. And so, okay, if we move the planes further away and make people walk, what would happen? And complaints dropped to zero. And so it's like, okay, so the thing is like perceptively, like 7 minutes, 5 minutes walking, 2 minutes waiting. Oh my God, my suitcase is really quick versus 2 minutes walking, 5 minutes waiting. And so then when you see like, okay, the pain point is the waiting is frustrating. How do you actually solve for that pain point? Like, and then that's when you start designing, okay, what is the solution? Because that's a UX solution, which might not be unethical, but it's worked for the rubric of we need to reduce complaints. And then you think to yourself, okay, is that the real pain point? Reducing complaints? Is it better education? Oh, look, your thing's going to be here in 7 minutes. Wait, you're maybe educating the passengers that this is how long it actually takes. Like you can only fry an egg in 5 minutes. You can't do it in 2 minutes. It's like technically maybe 2 minutes, but there's a point where it's technically impossible without salmonella poisoning, right? And so that's when the creator, how can we educate? And then once you get, okay, this is the baseline concept. What's the airline's design system? Okay, this is the typeface, this is the logo, and that's where the creativity, I think, happens. I mean, and if it's hard for designers, then maybe UX, you want to be agency and working in branding and that. But then even then, it's like how many times are you going to get to rebrand a large company? Most likely, it's going to be a small company that no one knows about, and so it's catch-22 for designers.
No, and totally. I think it's so interesting what you mentioned with I mean, like there's a coin for this, basically artificial friction, right? You add artificial friction to your user experience or your customer journey, if you want to say so. And there are many examples like this. And I think the example you brought up is like super cool. I actually have never heard about that story. Also, stories how we, for example, integrate it into a digital product, right? Like, if people look at a spinner and if it's like moving a little bit more dynamic, and like people like feel like the waiting period is actually the website is actually faster, right? Or they perceive it as less annoying, right? If you use aspects like slow loading methods and like animations, etc., how a website is loading, you can really entertain someone, and like people, and not mad at like a slow website if it has to load like a heavy content.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, there was a book called, I forgot what it's called. It's somewhere up in my library. He was a PhD. He worked at Microsoft, and his whole thing was designing loading screens. And one thing that was interesting, he says, like, if you have like a loading bar, that's 100%, 10% of the file is loaded, so you show 10% on the bar. That would be like the purest engineering way of doing it. But he says, like, no 10% of time is the same perceptively. And so the patience of a person weans over time. So instead of showing 10% is 10%, wait for 30% to load and you show 10%. And as you get longer, you make quicker jumps on the loading bars, then it feels perceptively fast. Like YouTube does this. Like when you load a video, you have a loading bar at the top. It staggers and then loads because it's like, oh my God, it's quicker.
Yeah, relief. You end with on a positive note, right?
Yeah. And so you think to yourself, well, that's a lie, right? But then isn't like the airplane is a lie? Like it doesn't need to park over there. And so the question is like, is it ethical to do that? Or is it about education, telling the user, no, this is just how this thing is. It's like you have a slow internet connection. What is your expectation here? But can you do that if someone needs to load a video quickly because they have to learn how to change an appy? They ain't got time to be. You have to educate me on, So it's an interesting dynamic.
No, 100%. And I think you're already touching on visual perception and getting people used to certain things.
It's interesting looking at all of these features, trying to understand what people are trying to do. Like that's what is the job to be done. So I mean, we were speaking about this earlier in the week.
Defining the problem correctly.
Yeah. So like Gmail discovered that people were saving large attachments to drafts and never sending them. It turns out that this was like in 2008 when Google Drive and Dropbox didn't exist. And so the Dropbox founder said, we were sick and tired of saving attachments to emails. We needed an experience. And I remember back then, it's like zip disks and USB drives. I'd have loads carrying with me because that's how you carry data. It seems so archaic now. It's like, it's like caveman. Like if you think about it, it's like so backwards. But then the experience, and in hindsight, it's obvious. But it was such a hard thing to do well. And then when Dropbox figured out the technical complexity, the user experience was perfect.
This is the accessibility, right? Like drag and drop, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that was phenomenal. That was like something from the future. Now that's an expectation in terms of like everything should be syncing like that now. But like back then, that was, and I think Steve Jobs, Apple tried to buy Dropbox, and they took him to his office, and he's trying to schmooze them. And then they're like, no, we don't want to sell it. And Steve Jobs screaming, you're not a product, you're a feature. It's like, but it's interesting, like and in a sense, he was right. It's become an expected feature. Like people are not just on one device, they traverse multiple devices. And so, so it's interesting how I call it user fudged experience, where people are improvising the experiences of tomorrow with the tools of today. And it's often in a messy way. So saving drafts, it's like, how would you, like, as a designer, how would you tease that out? What are they trying to do? Like, how do you even go about doing that? But you see that a lot. Like sticky note paper is usually a telltale sign. When people put in sticky notes and writing stuff and sticking it on physical devices, that usually tells something's wrong with the device. So there was like shared last week where there was like a tap and pay in the US, and the coffee shop's like, no, you need to tap the phone here. Yeah. And it's like they done it because how much time have they spent? No, put your phone here. No, and that just wastes a lot of the barista's time, like, And so, but how do you get that in digital products? It's much harder because you have to watch people. So diary studies, ethnographic studies, if you can do that.
Really watching someone using the product, understanding like what is the actual problem, right? And it's an interesting thing. If you develop a product, you don't really know how people are going to use it. So some use it just in a different way. So like they make their own solutions. They hack their own system. Like they're using Google for saving files, like Google Mail.
Yeah, so, I mean, it was an interesting challenge, especially when I was working on Chrome at Google, because Chrome is basically like an operating system. Mm-hmm. And so you can't create standard prototypes and get people to run through it, because a lot of Chrome's usage is about intent. Like if you're visiting a site, sharing your location, it's about the intent at the moment. Asking someone, would you share your location, is completely out of context, so it makes no sense. Yeah. And so we would do what they call experiments, A/B tests, over 10% of the audience. And so you get an understanding of usage, but without the why. And then so you do some prototyping and try to map out the mental model of where users think data is being saved. And there's different techniques, but it's very hard to do ethnographic studies with like something like that, because how do you watch someone 24 hours a day using their phone? Because people don't. It's a very tricky thing.
Yeah, like with these products you open constantly, it's maybe a little bit more, let's say, easy if you say like redesign a banking experience, and like you watch someone like how they log on their computer and like use it and so on. But like with these instant experiences, like of course like people also behave different, like if they're in a testing environment. So you need to work also a lot with data. What can you get from the user behavior data just out of the system? I think we need to wrap it up very soon. But I think like something that I think I would be very interested, because you have been working in so many different environments. Is there any kind of particular project that comes to your mind where you said like, this was one of my favorite projects, specifically maybe also you notice maybe the impact that you can have as a designer, maybe for the end user, for the business, or in any other way?
I mean, I think at the moment, it would definitely be, say, like the stuff I did on Chrome. So I redesigned like their install UI for web apps. So you have progressive web apps, which is a website that you can install and has the capabilities of an app. Well, the technology is improving all the time. And so if you look at the original install UI, which was just basically is a white modal that said as the home screen, had no context. And so I went through a bunch of research, like redesigning the iconography around it, and trying to understand what this means to people, and basically replicated Play Store type UI. I mean, that was like, because again, it was like for the last
making it feel familiar.
Yeah, for the last 10 years, users are associate installation with store UIs. 20 years ago, it would have been CD-ROMs, floppy disks, downloads.com. But the mental model has changed. So it's like, let's meet the people where they are. So the UI you show. So developers couldn't show screenshots of their app, but so that's what we introduced. And it was quite like the security team were not like, well, this is really risky. It's like, we went ahead and did it because obviously there's a fear that people could be spoofed into installing nefarious things. But I mean, there's also like blockers.
You don't have the security that, of course, the ecosystem brings, right?
But yeah, like so the Play Store even the Play Store has been fooled. I mean, so all of them have. But it was because you're going to a website and you're showing the URL of the website in the UI. There are ways to kind of mitigate it. And at the end of the day, you have to allow people to be people to make the choice for themselves. And ideally, you would prevent nefarious things on the web to do that. But when we actually did it, it was like a big risk because it's like you're changing this UI. But it was really successful. Like one of the major sites doubled their installation rate, like, from 20,000 to 40,000 installs. And all of the major companies like Telegram, Twitter, implement this was. I think that's possibly what got me the job, because when I showed them my portfolio, like, oh my god, he's designing stuff for us already. And Tinder, Telegram, basically everyone who begins a product with T seems to have implemented it. And it was really successful. The web developer community loved it. I think that one component I designed, all these developers around the world using it. I mean, to me, and I felt like I was fixing something that was broken. And so that was. I don't know if I'll ever, it's such a small thing, but I don't know if I'll ever have that degree of impact again, because unless you work for a browser, which is like Chrome has 3 billion users. But like.
Yeah, there's a scale involved, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it's such a small thing, like part of a big ecosystem. So that was really cool. And I've had many different things. Like I'm doing stuff at the moment, Twitter, which I can't share, but which is really cool. Have an impact on the team there. But then once you get to a point in your design career, it's not necessarily just about designing products. You're designing teams, you're designing processes to help other designers junior to you to create things. So that's a lot of things which I'm looking at the moment. And so, yeah, like, but, and also it's a team sport. Like it's not you as the individual person. So, yeah, but like,
the web app, the web progressive web system is interesting, or the progressive web apps. I also worked on a few, and of course, like it's very different to Android and iOS.
Yeah.
You like for the iOS users, it's still like tough to kind of crack, but for the Android users, way more familiar. Of course, there are different reasons.
Well, Apple blocks everything because I think the idea is it's a risk to the App Store. But
yeah. I think like if progressive web app works, or like that principle of like you don't have to download anymore, of course, like they can have a large impact to people because my application just way more accessible and instant to use, right?
Yeah.
And I think with the overall story, I think you're talking about here is the law of familiarity, right? So picking up people where they are, that's like key in user adaptation. So actually, I think there's no black and white. I mean, like there's also the aspect of newness and the excitement of something that is maybe different. But when it comes to just like having the mainstream adapt to maybe something new, I think like being familiar and like understanding like, okay, what is their mental state? Okay, they're thinking like downloading apps. Okay, how do the people use it? What are the visual and interaction parameters there? What could we mimic, and like which steps we need just so we make it familiar, and like which things we can actually drop because we don't need them. And I think that's sort of like, I think a good way to approach. I think like still like very often designers don't think about that enough. Like, like what's the mental state of the person? What's their expectations for the first 3 seconds when they open a website? Like, and then when they land on it, what did they actually understand? But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting space.
Yeah. So Mustafa, thank you so much for taking time. I could continue for another hour with you. I think like the chat is really good, but I think we need to wrap it up because of time. And but thank you so much for sharing your insights here with the audience on the podcast.
Thank you.
Alright, that was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments about your thoughts and biggest learnings from the episode. I'm always super curious about that. You can also tag me in a post about your biggest takeaway and share your insights with others to pass on your learnings. If the episode provided you a lot of value, make sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with friends and colleagues so they also have the chance to learn and grow. Until next time, cheers.